The morning the whole thing happened, I was running late. Not fashionably late, not accidentally late. The kind of late where your coffee is still on the kitchen counter and your shoes aren't quite tied and you're half jogging down the mall with a camera bag slapping against your hip like it's punishing you for something. I'd been photographing the changing of the guard for 3 years. Press accreditation, specific position markers, the whole system. You learn the rhythms of it. You know where to stand so the light hits the bearskin hats at that particular angle. You know which, well, guards have the slightly straighter posture. You know roughly, what's going to happen and when. That morning I didn't know anything. It was October, and the particular kind of October that London does better than anywhere else on Earth. The sky a low, heavy gray that's not quite threatening rain but isn't quite promising anything either. The kind of gray that makes the gold on the palace gates look warmer than it actually is. The trees along the mall had started dropping, not dramatically, just quietly one leaf at a time, like the city was letting something go. There, for what it's worth, were maybe 300 tourists already gathered by the time I got to my position. More than usual for a Tuesday. School groups from what looked like 3 different countries, identifiable by their fluorescent lanyards, yellow, orange, a particularly aggressive shade of green, couples with matching rain jackets, a man with a selfie stick longer than some small children, an elderly woman in a pale blue coat who had clearly arrived at approximately 5 in the morning to secure the front rail, and she had a thermos and absolutely no intention of moving for anyone. The guards were already in position. The ceremonial precision of it, you never quite get used to it, actually. Even after 3 years, there's something about the absolute stillness of a human being who has decided that stillness is their entire occupation. The bearskins, the red tunics, the rifles held, at exactly that angle. They're not statues, but they perform stillness the way statues wish they could. I set pretty much up my shot, checked my exposure. The tourists buzzed, normal. Everything was completely normal. I should tell you what I knew about that day before I got there, because it matters. Now there had been rumblings in the press for weeks, and I mean the serious press, not the ones who run headlines about royal shoe choices, about changes to certain ceremonial duties. Specifically, questions had been raised about the physical and psychological toll on the guards themselves, medical disclosures, union conversations, the kind of institutional reckoning that moves slowly in old places, like water finding its way through old stone. I'd covered some of it peripherally. Talked to a couple of former guards off the record. One of them, a man in his mid-40s, soft-spoken, who'd served 8 years, had said something that stayed with me. He'd said, "People think the hard part is the standing still. It isn't. The hard part is standing still while the world treats you like furniture." I thought about that a lot. And I was thinking about it, actually, as I stood at my position that Tuesday morning, watching the tourists press against the barriers and lift their phones. The thing about photographing ceremonies is that you're always looking for the moment when something human breaks through the ceremony. That's the shot. Plus, that's always the shot, not the perfection of it. Anyone can photograph perfection. The moment when the human being inside the uniform is briefly, undeniably visible. I didn't expect, for what it's worth, that moment to involve Camilla. I should be precise about the timing. The official car arrived at 10:47. I remember because I checked my timestamp later more than once. Black. Moving at that particular pace that official cars move. Not slow exactly. Deliberate in a way that ordinary traffic never is. So like the car itself understands it's carrying something that shouldn't be rushed. The crowd shifted. That collective look, body language thing that happens when something significant moves through a space, heads turning, phones rising, a ripple of attention moving through 300 people like wind through the trees above us. She stepped out. I've photographed Camilla before. Not extensively, but look, enough to have a sense of her. There's a quality, she's in public, that I've always found difficult to photograph well. A watchful composure, like someone who learned long ago that every room is also an audience, and has made a kind of peace with that. Not cold, more like practiced. A person who knows the weight of being looked at and has decided to carry it without, showing the effort. That morning, she looked different. I noticed it immediately and couldn't immediately say why. She was dressed appropriately. Coat, the right kind of hat, all of it correct. To be fair, her posture was correct. She was moving at the right pace toward the waiting officials, but her jaw was doing something. It sounds small. Sort of it was small. Plus a tightening around the lower face that you only catch if you're looking through a lens and your job is to notice faces. The barely there tension of someone who's holding something in with the specific effort of a person who has been holding things in for a very long time. I adjusted my focal length, which something told me not to look away. The ceremony began as it always begins. The guards moved. The precision of it, I'll never not find it remarkable, honestly. The coordination required, I rehearsed until it's in rehearsal anymore, but muscle memory. The body knowing what to do so the mind doesn't have to. Left foot, right foot, exactly there. Plus the sound of boots on the forecourt. Camilla stood at the appropriate distance, flanked by officials, doing what's done at these occasions. Present, attentive, performing the particular kind of attention that's expected of someone in her position. The tourists were documenting everything with the frantic energy of people who have traveled a long way to stand in the cold. And then, nothing happened at first. That's important to understand. There was no triggering incident that I could see. No stumble, no disruption from the crowd, no visible communication from any aid. She simply stopped. In the middle of the courtyard, with the ceremony arranged around her and 300 cameras pointed in the general direction of the whole thing, Camilla stopped walking, stood completely still, which would have been unremarkable. She was supposed to stand still, except that the officials around her kept moving for 2 or 3 beats before realizing she wasn't with them anymore, and then they stopped, and the whole forecourt went with them. I don't know exactly how to describe what a large outdoor crowd sounds like when it goes genuinely quiet. It's not silence, there's always some sound. A distant siren, the trees well, somebody's phone notification going off from inside a pocket. But there's a quality of attention that descends when something unexpected happens in a public space, where even the people who don't know what they're looking at understand that they should be looking. That quality descended on Buckingham Palace at 10:51 on a Tuesday morning in October. The guard nearest to her, I'll call him by the position he held, not his name, because I don't know his name, and wouldn't use it if I did, had been standing at his post for what I later learned was 47 minutes. Not the, longest stretch by any measure, but long enough. Camilla looked at him, which not a glance. Not the practiced moving through the room attention that royals deploy at public events. She stopped, and she looked at this specific guard the way you look at someone when you've suddenly decided to actually see them. He was young. That was obvious even from my position. And even under the bearskin and the ceremonial weight of the uniform, the particular stillness he was maintaining was immaculate. Kind of perfect, actually. Textbook. And she stood there, looking at it, for 5 seconds, maybe 6. In public ceremonial time, that's an eternity. I had my finger on the shutter and I wasn't pressing it. Some moments you don't photograph, which you just don't. Something tells you to put the camera down and use your actual eyes, because this is going to be one of those things you'll want to have seen properly, without the viewfinder between you and it. I kind of put the camera down. She spoke. End of part 1. Fun fact. Continued in part 2, the words. Nobody expected I couldn't hear her from where I was standing. That's the honest truth of it. And I want to be honest, because the versions of this story that circulated afterward varied wildly, the way stories always do when they pass through enough hands. What I think can tell you is what I saw. What I can tell you secondhand, from the aide who was standing 6 feet to her left, a woman named Margaret who I spoke to later and who'sn't given to exaggeration. is what was actually said. But first, what I saw, and Camilla spoke. The guard didn't react. He honestly wasn't supposed to react. That is the entire architecture of what he was doing. The whole point was the not reacting, the remaining exactly where he was regardless of what moved around him. Wind, rain, tourists pressing too close, plus the weight of the uniform on a gray October morning, irrelevant. He stayed. She spoke again. Something changed in his posture. And not dramatically. This wasn't a flinch or a startle. It was smaller than that. The almost invisible adjustment of someone whose body has just received information that it doesn't know what to do with. Like the cellular level of him understood that something unprecedented was occurring, even while every trained instinct he had was saying, "Stay still, stay still, stay still." An aide stepped forward. Camilla held up her hand. Not the wave, not the practiced, honestly public gesture. The other one. The flat palm. The unambiguous signal that means, "I'm not finished. Don't." The aide stopped, which I've been trying to figure out how to describe what the next minute felt like, and I keep running into the problem that describing it accurately makes it sound smaller than it was. So let me try from a different angle. There's a quality of attention that changes the atmosphere of a space the way temperature changes it. You don't see it, but you feel it, on the back of your arms, in the way your breathing slows down. That's what happened to the courtyard. The ceremony had suspended itself around this one moment, and none of the 300 people watching fully understood why. All of them felt that they were witnessing something that wasn't supposed to happen, that was happening anyway, and that it mattered. The elderly woman, in my opinion, in the pale blue coat at the front rail, was no longer holding her thermos. She was holding it against her chest, with both hands, watching. "What Margaret told me," Camilla said, "and I'm giving you this as closely as Margaret remembered it." Which she said was verbatim, because she's the kind of mind that records things accurately and the kind of composure that lets her record them even while feeling the floor shift slightly under her feet. "How long have you been standing there?" That was the first thing. The guard, to his credit and his training, said nothing. Stared, in my opinion, straight ahead, and the discipline of it must have cost him something in that moment, because she wasn't asking the way a person asks a question they already know the answer to. She was asking the way a person asks when they actually want to know. So she asked again. "I'm asking you directly. How long?" Margaret said that Camilla's voice in that moment wasn't raised, was not emotional, in the obvious ways. It was the voice of someone who had asked a question many times in private rooms, in formal meetings, in the soft language of institutional inquiry, and had been given careful, managed, diplomatically softened answers every single time. And had, at 10:52 on a Tuesday, in October, decided that she was no longer interested in the soft version. The guard, and this, Margaret said, was the moment where she herself had to work to keep her own face still. The guard said, 47 minutes, ma'am." Camilla nodded, slowly, the for what it's worth, nod of someone who has just had a number confirmed that they already suspected but needed to hear spoken out loud, in front of witnesses, in a space where it couldn't be quietly walked back or reframed in a memo. She turned to the senior official standing to her right. A man I'll describe only as a senior palace official, because his specific role isn't the point, and he's the kind of person who would prefer not to be the point. What she said to him, and this part Margaret didn't hear verbatim, but she heard enough to reconstruct it, was something in the territory of, "We are going to have a real conversation about this. Not a review, not a working group, plus a real conversation. Today." The official nodded. The kind of nod that means, yes, absolutely, certainly, of course, whatever you need. The kind of nod that means underneath that, this isn't how this is done. And then The outburst. Because here's the thing about that word, outburst, that I've been sitting with since the story started moving through the press. It implies something uncontrolled, something that breaks loose from the person and runs ahead of them. And I suppose by the measure of what's considered appropriate in that setting, what happened next qualified. But it wasn't rage, and it wasn't collapse. It wasn't anything actually I've ever seen described correctly in the coverage. She turned back to the guard. He was still standing exactly where he had been. Still. Ceremony still technically suspended around them, all of it paused like someone had their thumb on a remote, and she said, and this part Margaret heard clearly, and two other witnesses I spoke to separately confirmed. You shouldn't have to stand like a photograph. You're a person. I'm sorry it's taken this long for someone to say that out loud where it counts. 47 minutes. That's how long the guard had been standing there before those words were said to him. 22 years. That, roughly, is how long the institution had been operating on the assumption that no one needed to say them. I'm not making an argument here. I want to be clear about that. I'm a photographer, and I document. The arguments belong, to the people whose lives are shaped by what gets documented. But I stood there in that courtyard in October with my camera lowered. I watched a young man in a bearskin hat receive those words, and I watched what happened to his face. His face didn't break. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He maintained because he's trained to maintain, and because he was still on duty, and because that's what he knows how to do. But his eyes changed. The way eyes change when something lands that you didn't know you were waiting for. That specific shift, pretty much. Not of expression, but of depth. Yeah, like a room where someone has turned on a light in a back corner that you didn't even realize was dark. I raised my camera. I took the photograph, which it's the one that ran everywhere. You've probably seen it, even if you don't know that's where it's from. The bearskin hat cutting the frame. Her face in profile, turned toward him, which is face forward, technically correct, technically ceremonially perfect. And the eyes. The photograph doesn't have a caption that explains what was said. It doesn't need one. People have been writing their own captions for it for weeks now, and almost all of them are getting at the same thing, in different languages, with different words. Something was seen. Something that had been standing there for a very long time, not flinching, not complaining, not moving, was finally, I'm in front of everyone, actually seen. The ceremony resumed 6 minutes later. I know because I checked, and 6 minutes is, in the context of a ceremony that has been running on precision for over a century, a remarkable amount of time for anything unscheduled. It resumed with the same exactness it always has. Boots on the forecourt, the movement, which the whole architecture of it snapping back into place like elastic released. But basically, it wasn't the same courtyard it had been at 1046. Something had shifted in it. Not the stones, not the gates, not the guards in their positions. The way the tourists were watching and, before, they'd been documenting. The frantic phone raising, the jostling for position, the general project of capturing something to show people later, or after. After those 6 minutes, they were watching differently. The old woman in the pale blue coat had put her thermos in her bag. She stood at the front rail with her hands folded, and she watched the rest of the ceremony the way you watch something you understand you are lucky to be present for. In my opinion, fluorescent lanyards had stopped bouncing. Even the selfie stick was down. I stayed until the cars left, which I always do. There's usually a shot in the aftermath, the guards releasing their posture by millimeters as the official vehicles move away, the ceremony breathing out, the return to the human. Small moments, easy to miss. That day, I wasn't really looking for shots anymore. I actually was standing there thinking about what the former guard had told me months earlier. in a actually quiet flat in Kennington, with a cup of tea going cold on the table between us. The hard part is standing still while the world treats you like furniture. I thought about 47 minutes. I thought about the way the eyes change when someone finally says the thing you didn't know you needed to hear. And I thought, not for the first time in my career, but more sharply than usual, about the difference between witnessing something and documenting it. How sometimes those are the same act. How sometimes they pull in opposite directions. How on very rare mornings, in very old courtyards with gray October light doing what it does to gold gates, they collapse into one. I was there, and I had my camera. I was lucky. End of part 2. Concluded in part 3. What changed after the photograph ran on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, I had 47 missed calls. I know the number because it felt like a sign. 47, same as the minutes on the clock. I wrote it down in the margin of my notebook, the way I write things down when I think I'll want to remember the texture of them later. Actually, editors, news desks, 3 documentary production companies, a woman, basically, from a foreign press agency who spoke very fast and wanted to know if I had video. I didn't, and then wanted to know if I had. More photographs. I did, but none like that one. And who finally, when she'd exhausted her questions, said, "I don't know why this picture is doing what it's doing. Do you?" And I said, "I think I do, yes." I want to talk about what happened after. Not the kind of press cycle that moved the way press cycles move, quickly and loudly, and then quieting into the longer, a slower conversation that's actually the point. I want to talk about the specific human aftermath, the parts that don't photograph. The guard? I've been careful not to name him, and I'll stay careful because he didn't ask to be in this story. Gave one interview. A single, brief conversation with a journalist from a broadsheet who had the decency to keep it short. What he said in the piece was this: that he had been prepared for everything the job required, that he hadn't been prepared for that he meant that in the best way he knew how to mean something. When the journalist asked him what it felt like, standing there, hearing those specific words from that specific person in that specific place, he was quiet for what the journalist described as a long time. And then he said, "Like someone opened a window in a room I didn't know was closed." I read that, and I sat with it for a while. Here's what I know about what came next, and I want to be honest about what I know directly versus what I assembled from other sources because the story deserves accuracy. Within 10 days of that Tuesday morning, 3 things happened. First, a formal review was announced, and I mean formal with teeth. Not the kind of review that produces a 60-page document that immediately goes into a drawer. People with real authority over real outcomes were put in the room. The second, a rotating duty schedule, one that had been proposed internally and stalled for, depending on whose account you believe, somewhere between 3 and 6 years, was approved and dated for a dation. And the third, a statement, was issued, which brief, unflashy. The kind of institutional language that doesn't make for gripping reading, but carries weight when you know what it's responding to. The relevant line, as near as I can reproduce it without pulling the document. That the welfare and dignity of those serving ceremonial duties isn't a secondary concern, but a primary one. And that this standard is to be reflected in practice rather than policy alone. I read it 3 times when it came out. In practice rather than policy alone. That phrase. Somebody chose that phrase carefully. I went back to Buckingham Palace on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the photograph ran. No press sort of credential that day. I switched just myself and a camera, and the particular restlessness that sends you back to places where significant things happen to see whether the place itself has changed or whether it's only you. It was a Saturday in November by then, colder, The sky doing something dramatic with purple clouds over the Victoria Memorial. More tourists than the October Tuesday, actually. A big school group, matching yellow lanyards this time. A whole country's worth of enthusiasm corralled into a crocodile line. I mean, the ceremony was running. I stood at the back, away from the rails with my camera in my bag. The guards were exactly where they always are. The precision was TBH, exactly what it always is. The bearskin hats caught the thin November light, and the boots hit the forecourt. With the same exactness they always have, going back further than any individual story goes. And pretty much, I stood there watching, with my camera in my bag. There was a girl, 12, maybe 13, standing near me. Not with the school group. With a woman who was probably her mother, both of them in matching navy jackets, the daughter with a very serious camera of her own, not a phone, an actual DSLR. That was slightly too large for her, and which she was handling with the intense concentration of someone recently converted to a new religion. She was photographing the guards. She had found, somehow, either by instinct or by having watched someone else do it, the exact angle that catches the light on the bare skin and the face underneath simultaneously. She was holding the camera steady, waiting, the way you wait when you know the shot isn't there yet. I watched her waiting. I thought about the first time I stood in this exact courtyard with a camera. That well was too big for me, waiting for something human to break through something ceremonial. The first time I understood that the ceremony itself was never the point. The ceremony was the container. The point was always the person inside it. The girl pressed look, the shutter. Whatever she got it. I could tell from the way her shoulders dropped very slightly. The involuntary exhale of a person who's captured exactly what they were after. She lowered the camera, looked at the screen on the back. Looked back up, I think, at the guard. I don't know what she was thinking. I don't know what she saw in the photograph she'd just taken. I don't know if she knew anything about what had happened 3 weeks earlier in this same place. But she looked at the guard with that look. Honestly, the seeing look. The one that's different from the documenting look. And then she looked back at her photograph. Margaret, the aide who'd been standing 6 feet to Camilla's left on that Tuesday morning, agreed to have coffee with me a month after. This was off the record, mostly. She wanted to talk and didn't want to be quoted, which I respected. I'm not going to repeat most of what she said. But there was one thing she gave me permission to use, and I've been waiting for the right place to put it. She said that she had worked in royal contexts for many years, that she had seen a great many things that she hadn't expected to see, and that this had given her a fairly calibrated sense of what was surprising versus what only appeared surprising. I said that Tuesday morning was genuinely surprising. I asked her what she meant by that, because from the outside it had looked, to some people, like a calculated moment. A gesture, the kind of thing that gets planned. Plus, she looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how honest to be. Then she said, "She's been carrying that for a long time. It just finally got too heavy." I didn't ask her to elaborate. Some things you don't ask to elaborate. The last thing I want to tell you is about a letter. I received, about 6 weeks after the photograph ran, a handwritten letter. Post, not email. This already tells you something about the person who sent it, or about the generation they belong to, or both. It was from a man who identified himself only as a former household cavalry member. He'd, I guess, served, he said, on in the late 90s. He'd seen the photograph and he wanted to tell me something. He wrote, and I'm going to paraphrase this rather than reproduce it because it was his, and it was private, and it was beautiful in the way that private, careful, handwritten things are. He wrote that there was a quality of loneliness particular to ceremonial duty that he'd never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't stood in it, that the uniform is a kind of isolation, that the ceremony holds you absolutely still while the world moves around you and looks through you, and that after enough time you begin to understand, in your body, what it means to be treated like part of the architecture. He pretty much said the photograph wasn't a photograph of a guard and a queen. He said it was a photograph of a person being reminded that they are a person. And then he wrote, "I stood in that exact spot for 6 years. I wish someone had said that to me then. But I'm glad someone said it now. There's no clean ending to this. That's not a failure of the story. It's the shape of stories that are still happening. The rotating schedule went into effect. The review is still underway. The for what it's worth photograph is still doing whatever photographs do when they escape their context and travel through the world on their own. The guard is still serving, which I know that much. Margaret is still working. The school groups, honestly, are still coming, yellow and orange and aggressively green lanyards, phones in the air. Somewhere in the archive of a 13-year-old girl who was standing near me on a Saturday in November is a photograph of a guard that she took herself out in a courtyard, where something shifted 3 weeks before she got there, in light she hadn't thing to do with and didn't need to explain. And somewhere there's a room, a real room with people in it, with authority over real outcomes, where someone is sitting across a table from someone else, and the words being used aren't soft ones, and the document being written won't go into a drawer. I don't know that for certain, but I was in that courtyard. I lowered my camera when it mattered and raised it when it mattered more. And I know what I saw. Sometimes a person stops. In the middle of everything arranged and expected and proceeding correctly, sometimes a person stops, looks at the thing everyone else has agreed to stop seeing, asks the question that's obvious and obvious and obvious, and has therefore never been asked. And that's not an outburst. That's a door opening. The palace was quiet for 6 minutes on a Tuesday morning in October. Some silences are the loudest things a place has ever held. End total story and 3 parts. 1 morning. 1 question. Some things only need to be said once in the right place, loud enough.